believe in truth, at least as a category, even if it's an empty one, as Nietzsche said. You always need to remind yourself there's a category of truth, albeit empty, lest you come to believe your favorite fictions would fit nicely in that category. What business do you have saying, yeah, it's got to be true, so I believe it to be true? Fundamentalism has demonic aspects in that it splits the conscience of its thoughtful adherents and forces them to repress knowledge of which they are secretly aware. So why is the fundamentalist and the apologist on the war path? Well, it's against himself. The unbeliever that he goes on crusade against is in his own mind. Documents, the reports of the past, are not authorities. They are sources. It is the historian who is the authority. Maybe he doesn't want to be.
Welcome to Gnostic Informant. Today, my special guest, legendary, two-time PhD and a master's in theology. Is that correct?
Well, actually, I have 3 masters and 2 PhDs, but what the heck?
That's crazy. All right, yeah, so fully decorated, legendary thinker, Robert Price. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. It's an honor.
I'm really fascinated in your argument for the mythicism of the New Testament in general, Jesus of Nazareth. But you didn't start there. You started off on the other side a long time ago, where you, if I'm not mistaken, you were also a pastor or a minister.
Yeah, though I was entertaining the mythicist point of view toward the end of that, but it was a gradual but radical turnaround, I have to admit.
Wow. Okay, so what do you think is your take us through your argument of the mythicism versus the historicist, sort of how you came to that conclusion?
Well, I guess back when I was teaching at Mount Olive College, I was reading a book called The Jesus of the Early Christians by George A. Wells, now sadly departed. And I wrote all sorts of objections in the margins and, oh, what about this? And so on. But I thought I wanted to take the guy seriously. In the Life and Teaching of Jesus course I was about to do at this college. And because he said nobody gives it a fair shake, it's boycotted. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I want to try to understand it sympathetically and make the case and then evaluate it if I still don't buy it. But the more I got into it, the more I would take a second look at what I had written in the margins and say, maybe he does have a point here. And I'd begin to think of what he probably would say if I could talk with him about it. And I began to think this is not outrageous or outlandish. And it took a while, though, several years before I came to think, I bet he's right. I bet there was no historical Jesus. And there were a bunch of things like the absence of any demonstrable documentation of any kind of Jesus in the time in which it would matter. Like it turns out that various lines of argument have convinced me that the Testimonium Flavianum, that passage in Josephus, is spurious, a Christian interpolation, and this idea that he did mention Jesus, but yeah, in its present form, it's been interpolated and gussied up to be Christian friendly. That's just trying to make a bad text good. There's no reason to think that.
I always wondered so it seems like everybody agrees that there's some sort of forgery or at the very least an interpolation when we're talking about Josephus, book 18 of the Jewish Antiquities. And where do people think is how far is it forged, and how much of it actually do they think was there? Like, do they have an idea of what was said?
Yeah, the big thing is I think they believe that the blaming of the execution of Jesus on the Jewish authorities, the chief men among us, he says, is probably added. And maybe the miracles that briefly mentioned that he did, I think the word is actually paradoxa, paradoxes, mysterious things. And especially when the passage has Josephus saying, he was the Christ of whom these and many other things were foretold.
And then never mention it again. And it's like, just no big deal. He, by the way, he was the Christ. All right. Anyways, back to, let's talk about ISIS now. Like, that's literally
yeah. And even worse, he says that the tribe of Christians extant to this day is named for him. Well, if you cut out the only reference to him being the Christ, what do you mean named after him? Wouldn't they be the Jesuits if that's the only name you gave?
That's a good point. I never thought about that.
But there's various the syntactical structure is different from the surrounding, I think, 3 episodes dealing with Pontius Pilate. Pilate is the
chapter before that, and then 2 chapters after that, he's slaughtering the Jews, like literally bringing in statues. They're revolting against him, and they're all getting killed. But then there's this little paragraph where it's like, well, this time it wasn't his fault; it was the Jews' fault. Like, that's a little odd. So I don't know what you think about that.
And well, of course, that's a big problem with the Gospels too, that they make Pilate almost Mr. Nice Guy. They don't really, I guess scholars tend to assume that when they discuss Pilate, most of their readers know his rap sheet, that he was a notorious Jew hater. And the way, because there's a decent amount of documentation on him in Philo Judaeus, writing around the 40s, and Josephus, and they're no fans.
Not at all. Yeah.
Suddenly we read in the Gospels that Pilate is bending over backwards to get Jesus off the hook, and if possible to replace him on the cross with Barabbas. And they're threatening him, you're no friend of Caesar if you let this so-called king of the Jews go. And he's intimidated by that, but he's not afraid of what would happen if he lets go a murderer, an insurrectionist, as the text calls him, named Barabbas. It's just ridiculous. And but with Josephus, what they suggest is that he was perhaps the Christ, but there's no way really that makes any sense either, because Josephus owed his high position in the Roman government to his proclaiming the Emperor Vespasian as the Jewish Messiah predicted in the Bible. I mean, he said all that stuff. So that just can't be right. And it first appears in I think Eusebius is the preparation for the gospel, where he says that he's trying to combat some kind of Gnostic or other view of Jesus, or some criticism of Jesus, I forget, by pagans. And he says that he says, well, he was like this and like that, and somebody has noticed that point by point, the stuff that he quotes Josephus saying about Jesus are almost like tailor-made to refute the things he says he's rebutting, and it probably was tailor-made, and he was the tailor. Yeah. He's known to have done other stuff like that. And
I was thinking about Eusebius. If like, let's say, if the Bible was a person on trial, right? We're the judge. We're seeing it's on trial, and the Bible brings up Eusebius as as one of his what do you call it?
Witnesses.
Witness. Eusebius would be caught lying, and then it would be no more credible, because there's all these things in Eusebius text like, oh yeah, Philo, yeah, he was a friend of Peter's. We know him. He was one of us, basically. And that's what it says. It says all this history that's in Eusebius that historians and scholars are saying, wait a second, this didn't happen. So what? That it's funny to me how it's like with Christianity is the only topic where everything that is claimed, we just have to take it as true until we can prove it otherwise.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at the whole picture and saying, look at all these lies and forgeries and interpolations. Shouldn't this be a no more credible witness altogether?
Yeah, he actually says in that same book, The Preparation for the Gospel, that it's all right to tell lies to get people to believe in the capital T truth. I mean, that sort of rules him out immediately.
Right.
So he's, and in fact, even if he did write it in its present form, he wrote it too late to count as relevant evidence, because nobody doubts that Christians in his day were saying this stuff about Jesus. And the same disqualifies the famous Tacitus passage where he speaks of Christus, and does not mention the name Jesus, and he says this guy was crucified under the tenure of Pontius Pilate, and so on and so forth. But he's too late. He's writing like 125 or later in the 2nd century. How would he know anything about Jesus except from Christian reportage or propaganda, the preaching, I should say? I don't mean to say they were lying, but they certainly believed this, but he wouldn't have had any independent access. And so why would that matter? Bart Ehrman and others say, well, look, of course, Jesus would have gotten better press if he had done all these spectacular miracles, granted, but we're critical scholars. We're willing to say that stuff is legend, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a guy who attracted these legends. But the problem with that is, why would anyone have taken note of this guy if the real historical Jesus was just one of these wandering preachers and prophets and exorcists? I mean, we know of several other ones.
Yes.
I mean, if there were a dime a dozen, why?
Literally a dime a dozen.
Yeah, they're saying, like, why? If that's all he was, it's easy to see why historians wouldn't mention him. Like in an American history textbook, you're not going to find a chapter on Oral Roberts or something. Right. But then the problem is, you're saying it's as if we set out to discover the historical Superman. Granted, nobody could leap tall buildings in a single bound. Nobody could be invulnerable or lift cars over his head and make time go backwards. Of course, those are fictions. But there really was a historical Superman. And it turns out he was just Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter. Why would anybody have magnified Clark Kent, for Pete's sake, into Superman? So it's a self-defeating argument. It's just a desperate salvage attempt. And so the lack of attestation, I think, is pretty important.
So okay, so it's hanging on a thread, and this is what the thread basically is. You got the Pauline letters dating to the 50s, and Pauline mentions in Corinthians that 500 eyewitnesses reported that they saw Jesus resurrect. Now, people like Dr. Habermas say that somehow equals a firsthand account 3 days before or days and months after the resurrection. Somehow that qualifies for that, which I have no idea why. If that, I mean, like you're saying, okay, so you're saying, this is what he says. We have accounts that go back that far, days and months after the cross. And then you ask him, okay, what are they? Well, it's Paul mentioning it in Corinthians, which dates to the 50s, which, by the way, we don't have a manuscript of that till the 2nd century. So who knows if it even is the 50s? We just said that. We just said it was, and everyone disagreed on that. So, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem granting that, but it's like, you can't tell me that means it's a first-hand account when really it's the definition of a second-hand account. Literally, Paul's talking about other people mentioning it, which makes it second-hand account. And then you got to think about this. 500 people. That's a lot of people. It's probably more people that are going to watch this video in the next couple of days And none of them wrote it down. None of them said to a friend, hey, we got to go get a scribe over here and write this down. I just saw a man come back from the dead. None of them. And we have to wait for, what is it, 30 years before Paul decides to write down, oh yeah, we have 500 witnesses. Who are they? Even if I just saw one of them, then I'd be like, okay, the historicity is a slam dunk. Clearly, I mean, everybody else, like in history, you got Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. People are writing about him that are around him.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we see that with Jesus of Nazareth? We don't have anything. I mean, the first mention outside of biblical manuscripts is what we talked about before, Josephus. And I guess the best argument for Josephus is actually the verse about James being the brother of Jesus. But if you know Christianity, I mean, I used to be a Christian. We are brothers of the Lord. That's the title. And the word in Greek is actually adelphon, which I don't know. I'm not a Greek expert, but I think adelphon could mean brethren. I mean, I don't know. I could be wrong.
Yeah, that's true. This is it sort of reminds me of a couple of other things. One, the Apostles' Creed. The tradition was that that the different articles, I believe in this, I believe in that, and so forth, were contributed one by each of the 12 apostles who had gathered for the purpose of hammering such a thing out. But that's obviously ridiculous, and it goes back to the early 2nd century in the Roman Church. It was a baptismal creed. That's kind of like what this list of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 is. Gary Habermas, who, by the way, is a great guy and a friend of mine, as is Bart Ehrman. I hate to disagree with these guys. I like them personally. I know them.
I'm sure they're all great people, of course.
But they always say that Paul went to Jerusalem early on in his ministry, based on what it says in Galatians, and he must have learned this there, and that means he must have received this liturgical thing. I mean, it's like in a creedal formulation. First he appeared to this one, then he appeared to that one, and there's a kind of a metrical rhythm to it also, as if it is a piece of liturgy. But that's all just really slipshod inference. He doesn't actually say that. We don't know who originally wrote this. And I have argued, as I didn't know it at the time, but several previous scholars had argued that Paul didn't even write that this is an interpolation into 1 Corinthians 15, because it doesn't fit the topic of the rest of the chapter, where he's not trying to prove Jesus's resurrection. He's saying, look, elsewhere, he's saying, we all know Jesus rose, so why do you guys have a problem with the idea of resurrection? And of course, the real issue is they were Gnostics who didn't believe in a physical resurrection and were disgusted at the idea. But it doesn't seem to fit. And again, various scholars had noticed this long before I did. And so I don't think that is eyewitness material. And even if it were, suppose people had visions. Like, are you going to believe that a 900-foot tall Jesus appeared to Oral Roberts in Oklahoma because he said so? It's obvious these people are still believers, and in a way they're trying to put themselves in the shoes of skeptics to figure out what would convince them, but they're already convinced, and so they can't really do that, and they come up with these ridiculous things. As for the 500, I think that is an interpolation within the interpolation. You've got to ask, if this was that early a thing, why does no gospel writer ever mention that Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. It's just impossible. And in fact, we find out who those people are supposed to be when we read some manuscripts of the Gospel of Nicodemus, also called the Acts of Pilate, where people are reporting to Pilate what they've seen after the resurrection. We made a big mistake. This guy was the genuine article. Well, the 500 there turn out to be the Roman troops that Pilate assigned the Sanhedrin to put a guard on the tomb, and they were knocked over when it happened. And later they heard that this same guy was being seen alive up in Galilee, so they went up there, all 500 of them, and they saw the ascension. Well, it seems to me that's got to be, that tradition floated around, and some copyist later on said, well, this beats all the other resurrection appearances here, let's add it. And which is like the same way you got the Josephus interpolation. In a sense, it's like, boy, surely Josephus must have taken note of Jesus. I bet he did, and something happened. Let's pencil it in. I'm not ready to say it was just an intentional fraud. It might have been, but you can see how this happened with the habits of scribes. So I think that's a real problem. And the gospel resurrection stories, these are not records of anybody that saw these things. I mean, you can just tell from the delivery of it and the way it's put. You don't have people saying, I saw this. And they conflict on major things. You'd never convince a jury if you were saying, well, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead and women went to the tomb, but they didn't see him. And others say, oh yeah, the women at the tomb did see him. Right. And another one says, well, at first they didn't see him, but Mary Magdalene came back and she saw him. Wait a minute. And Mark, no resurrection appearances at all. It's just absurd to think that these are memories of something. And in fact, you can explain all the differences between them by literary criticism. You can see why Mark has one young man. Matthew makes him into an angel. Luke doubles him, so they're men, but two of them. And John has two angels. You can see various reasons, if you think about it for a minute, as to why they would have done that. And in fact, the fact that Matthew, Luke, and John have anything after the women fleeing from the tomb in terror shows you that this can't be historical testimony. Like, it's like they had to change Mark's ending to be able to add to it, because it might as well say the end. The women fled in terror. They said nothing to anyone, so they were afraid. Well, how do Matthew and the others know about it? Right. It's obviously got to be fiction.
And it amazes me how John, which everyone grants is the latest, the newest out of all of them, all of a sudden he remembers that zombies literally raised up from the ground and the earth was shaking and the sky was turning black. And yeah, everyone else forgot about that. But 30 years later, John was like, oh, I remember this one thing that happened that everyone forgot about.
Well, that was Matthew, but it's still the same distance. Really.
Oh, was it Matthew? Okay.
Yeah. Though there, I kind of like a modified version of what the Jehovah's Witnesses say about that. And of course, they're no miracle deniers or anything, but they say that given that there was an earthquake and that the rocks were splitting and all of that, and then that the dead appeared to presumably their relatives in Jerusalem, they think what it is saying is that the earthquake caused these hillside tombs to spring open, which very likely would have been the case, and that bodies were exposed. And the people in Jerusalem, knowing about this, said, "Oh my God, I hope Uncle Malachi's not there." And so they ran up there, and some of them did. Oh no, that's him, and that's all it meant. Well, that isn't quite what it says. But if you take into account that Matthew has changed the crucifixion account of Mark by adding the earthquake, which is an in Mark, and has made it more dramatic, I think it's not unlikely that this is another one of those changes where some scribe copying Matthew and read the Jehovah's Witnesses version, which would have been remarkable enough to record, decided that's not quite good enough. Let's have a resurrection of these dead. And then people kept fiddling with it because, wait a minute. Okay, they must have left the tomb after Jesus rose, because if they rose while he was being crucified, that would mean he wasn't the first fruits from the dead. So you had fumbling stuff going on here. Right. So again, you just can't, even if there is some sort of historical kernel, it's irrecoverable. There's just no way to penetrate the stained glass curtain, as I like to call it.
And also, it wouldn't be the first time a dying and rising God brought the dead back with them. I mean, that happened with Tammuz in one of the ancient cuneiform tablets that they found. There's a story that Tammuz dies. Tammuz is the god of agriculture, and then Ishtar descends down to hell and then saves him. And as she brings her, I think it's her husband, Tammuz, husband or brother, whichever one, I can't remember.
Both, I think.
Maybe both. So anyways, she brings him back up to earth. He brings the dead up with them, which is springtime, which is cool, kind of cool.
Yeah.
About springtime. And that's why all the plants grow, and that's why all the animals give birth. It's because of the resurrection of Tammuz. And then you see the same kind of myth happen with like Dionysus and all these other Osiris myths. And they're not exactly the same, like some people say. Like, you see in Zeitgeist, they're all exactly the same. And it's like, no, they have their clear-cut differences. But at the end of the day, we know that there's clearly some common denominators, like some big common denominators between these dying and rising. Like Plutarch wrote a whole manuscript about it called On Isis and Osiris.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes in and compares these deities, and basically, he even calls Osiris the Word, which I thought was kind of mind-blowing. And that was like in the 90s AD. No mention of Jesus, though, which is kind of odd as well. You think if he's on the subject of gods that are, deities or whatever, half gods that died and came back to life, you'd think he would mention that, but that's a little odd that he didn't. And then so that brings me to the next subject, is not just like what we're looking at. We're looking at the, what Josephus and the evidence, but the lack of, which is all these writers. There's tons of people that wrote books in the first century. Philo, Pliny the Elder. There's a whole list of people that wrote stuff on these subjects too. They're not even just like it's not like Pliny the Elder was like writing about like just what happened in the Colosseum and the sports. He was writing about like deified people. He was writing about prodigal births. He was writing about crazy things that happened, women that turned into a man. Every subject you can think of that was extraordinary, he was writing about it. So for the fact that 500 people, then not one of those people got to him while he's writing his encyclopedia, that doesn't make any sense. So something is up here. That's why I started to deconvert when I started to think about the stuff that was written then. That doesn't exactly, like, if this is real history and not just myth, you would think this would be written down in other accounts, not just Paul.
Yeah, and with the 500, why is none of them named? Why is there no attempt? I mean,
not even close. Yeah.
Now you couldn't look them up, nor could the Corinthians at the time. But still, you would think. I mean, he mentions other people, the household of Stephanus and all that stuff. You'd think he might mention them, but he doesn't. And it just well, that's another big building block of the Christ myth theory, that Paul, though he does mention a crucifixion and a resurrection, says strange things about it, that the crucifixion was engineered by the principalities and powers and the archons of this age, which is Gnostic and Jewish terminology for the prison guards of this earthly sphere, and who prevented the souls from going up to heaven. And that they didn't realize what we're doing when they put Jesus to death. They're really signing their own death warrants because they don't anticipate the resurrection. But if that isn't raw mythology, period, I don't know what is. But the dying and rising God myths are equally sketchy. Paul does not mention that Jesus had a teaching or healing ministry. He comes very close to saying Jesus didn't do any miracles when he says, now I know Greeks demand wisdom and Jews signs, but I'm sorry, we got to disappoint them. The only thing we have to speak of is Christ crucified, and I'm proud of it. I mean, that's a kind of a powerful thing. I'm not trying to ridicule it, but why does he not have miracles to appeal to if he knew Jesus was a miracle worker? You could say, well, he did miracles, but you know, those stubborn Jews, they wouldn't believe it. Well, why didn't he say that? You know, it just seems to me there's a tendency to read these texts as if they said what we would have said had we written them.
Right.
And so what was Paul's Christ? Well, if he was crucified and doesn't that mean he was on earth? Well, the fact that angelic forces did the job somehow. Now it could have been that they're referring to the old Jewish belief that every pagan country had a fallen angel behind it, whispering advice, telling them what to do and all that. But it doesn't say that. It would be very easy to say that, just like Daniel said with the Prince of Persia and Gabriel and all. It doesn't say that. So, okay, we've got demonic, angelic forces crucifying him. Well, where? Well, ordinarily you'd think on earth, but are there other hints in these early writings that indicate no, it was was in heaven before the world was made? Revelation says that he was put to death for our sins before the foundation of the world. Well, he can't have been crucified anywhere on earth if there wasn't an earth yet. And First Peter says something very similar, and so it's not a crazy notion as I first thought it was when I heard it years before. It does make sense, but the thing that really pushed me over the line was a research project I did some 20 years ago now, where I read a bunch of books where different scholars said, I bet you this gospel story is a rewrite of this Elijah or Elisha or Joshua or Moses or David's story. And there's several books on that. And I read, I don't know how many of them, 7 to 10. And I wasn't in agreement with all of them. Every case, I thought this argument seems a little tenuous to me. But before long, I had read enough of them that I had accumulated very plausible and persuasive parallels to the gospel, to virtually every gospel story. Maybe the only difference was, I don't know if I saw anything that was a good parallel to the rich young ruler, but that's about it. And that made me think, if they are based on, if they're rewrites of Old Testament stories from the Septuagint, how is it that nothing survives that looks like real history? Jesus isn't tied in with contemporary history. We already said that historians don't mention him, but even in the Gospels where he is attached to historical figures, it's very iffy, like Pilate again. From what we know about Pilate, can you take seriously these stories where he's trying to get Jesus off the hook? That scholars have always noticed that's a problem, even when they had never
Even
thought of
even
the idea.
Herod in Josephus, Herod's a hero. He's saving. He's like the savior of Israel, going left and right, winning battles and doing all this good stuff. And then in the Gospels, he's a baby killer. He's hunting down Jesus. He's horrible. He's this horrible guy. So that's like, why is it so different? Like you said, how can you trust an account that completely conflicts with historical accounts?
Or is so darn close to them that you just can't discount literary dependence. Like when Herod the Great tries to kill all the babies of Bethlehem, this is kind of like the Exodus story where Pharaoh tries to have the Hebrew babies killed. Doesn't
And
work,
Nimrod. There's an apocrypha book about Nimrod hunting down Abraham as a baby.
Oh, well, yeah, that part, yeah, you do have. I don't know if he winds up. Does he kill loads of other kids?
He kills another baby that he thought was Abraham, but his father Tamar, I think is Abraham's father's name's Tamar, right? Tamar gives him a slave's baby and says, "This is Abraham. Here's my son. Kill him." And he thinks he killed Abraham, but he killed a slave baby instead.
Brother.
That's from the book of Jasher.
Ah, yeah. I haven't read that recently enough. But it's just like the Josephus retelling of the Nativity of Moses, where he's not just trying to get rid of these potentially troublesome Hebrews. He knows about Moses because his wise men have seen stellar signs warning him of it. And he says, okay, that's why he wants to kill them all. And in another one from Pseudo Philo, his Biblical Antiquities, we have an angel warning Miriam, his sister, that God will protect Moses, the chosen one, and so on and so forth. I mean, it is just too close for comfort. And if Herod the Great really did this, why don't we hear about that in Josephus? Because it's like, Herod was a murdering paranoid. We know that.
Yeah.
He killed his own relatives with no compunction out of paranoid suspicions. Well, if they recorded so many of those, why not this loathsome act? And I could have done it. I mean, it's possible, but what's more probable? That's what the historian always has to ask.
Speaking of probable,
unattested here, but attested in a way that's exactly like Moses there.
Right. Speaking of probable, what are the odds that there's two Jesus of Nazareth that are killed on the Passover Eve for leading Israel astray, and both of their mothers was named Mary, who they thought was an adulteress? What are the odds of that? Because according to a lot of scholars, I don't know what you think about this, that the Talmud story is a different Jesus that happened in the 1st century BC. And I'm over here scratching my head, like, how could that be possible? So I'm willing to grant there was a historical Jesus. I just don't think it had anything to do with the myth of the Bible. I just think that they took this character. Maybe there was Jesus in Nazareth. I don't know. They took whoever it was and mythicized his life. I mean, I don't think that's crazy to say that. But then you got the Talmud, which is written way later. I get that, but still, they're recounting a historical event. Maybe it's an allegory. I don't know. But what do you think? What do you think about that? Like, where does that fall into all this?
Well, I tend to, like, this brings up the question: is this occasioned by the fact that Yeshua was a common name? I mean, all sorts of guys, like in Josephus, there's about 20 different guys with that name. And in fact, in the Talmud, I think he's called Jesus ben Perechiah. And well, some scholars have suggested that was Jesus. And there's a great and fascinating book by, let me see, what's the guy's name? I'm getting senile here. It's called "Did Jesus Live 100 Years BC" by G.R.S. Mead, And he says, these guys aren't the only ones to place Jesus back then. There's the Toledot Yeshu, or the generations of Jesus, which is a sort of supposedly a satirical Jewish anti-gospel that circulated in the Middle Ages, though there are loads, even hundreds of different versions of this. And now some scholars think that it goes back a good bit earlier, because some of the stories in it are mentioned in the 2nd century by Celsus and others. So was there another Jesus who got into trouble during the time of Alexander Jannaeus when he crucified all the Pharisees, and Jesus, who was a disciple of some Pharisee, had to skip the country to be safe? That's quite possible, but it's also possible and not unlikely that those who wrote or who came up with the stories that eventually got written in the Talmud just didn't really know the facts of the Christian story. It says that Jesus, where they definitely seem to be talking about the Christian Jesus, they have a kind of a parody of the virgin birth, where
Right.
Joseph is away and a Roman soldier at night in the dark, Jesus Pandera, which was a common Roman nickname, the Panther, for soldier. And he comes in and says, well, honey, I'm back earlier than I thought. And so they have sex with Mary, totally innocent of what's happening. Wow. And then later on, she meets Joseph when he comes back. And it's Joseph, then Pandera. And then so Jesus, when he is born, comes to be called Joseph, the son of Pandera, and is known to be a bastard, and becomes a false teacher and a smart ass who doesn't respect the rabbis, and does miracles even, but because he's picked up magical techniques in Egypt. And
call him Balaam, if I'm not mistaken. They equate him with Balaam from the Old Testament. Yeah,
they might. That's a big debate that's still going on today, because they have stories about Balaam, a couple of other ones, the unnamed Egyptian Messiah, Ben Stada, and so forth. And it's really confusing as to whether they mean Jesus there or not. They might, but some of it kind of doesn't fit as well. Some people think Ben Stada was Simon Magus, who has some similar adventures and so forth.
Wow, that's interesting.
But yeah, they have Jesus saying, I was prophesied, and he gives numerous prophecies, which nobody refutes, by the way. And he finally is turned in by his enemies and is stoned to death. Well, where did they get that idea? And Hugh Schoenfield, the famous author of the Passover Plot, he wrote a lot of interesting books. And in one of them, called The Hebrew Gospel, he says that he thinks that the most famous version of the Toledot Yeshu, in which Jesus doesn't really look that bad. I mean, as I say, nobody says he's wrong about these prophecies. That is really hard to believe if this is written as a counterblast to Christianity.
Wow.
And so what is going on here? But
that's what I'm getting.
It may be that they're just ignorant, or like Pandera. It's long been thought that that's satire and a distortion of Parthenos, the virgin. So instead of the son of the virgin, he's the son of the Panther, the Roman soldier, as in the Life of Brian, which I assume you've probably seen.
Yeah. Speaking of the Talmud, I don't know how much you know about this, but how there's passages about the Flavian dynasty, about Vespasian being their king. There's the story of the high priest Yohanan, and he sneaks out of Jerusalem because the Sicarii won't let him. And then he makes a deal with Vespasian, and he calls him his king. And then he says, good news, puts fat on the bones, Proverbs 30. And then he starts naming up all these Torah verses and saying that these are your prophecies. Basically, like, it sounds really weird that they would call Vespasian. And then he makes a deal with him. tells him to go ahead, sack my city, just save Yavne and its sages, and don't touch Gamaliel and them, and send some doctors over to these people. And it's almost like you're there. It's like a Talmud version of the rapture. If like me, I assume that the Revelation is an allegory of the sacking of Jerusalem, being the 7-year tribulation. I think that. But that's my speculation. I don't know who else thinks that. That's just me. But like, it almost sounds like that's what's happening. Like none of them were touched that aligned with Vespasian, and everybody else was utterly destroyed. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's historical fact. And Josephus proclaimed Vespasian the Jewish Messiah also.
Right.
This sounds like just a couple of cowards kissing imperial butt. But I'm not so sure, because in Isaiah 40, the beginning of the second Isaiah, you have God supposedly referring to Cyrus as my anointed, my Messiah.
Right.
And he does the will of God. In the very earliest days of Islam, according to a great book by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook called Hagarism, they show how Islam rapidly evolved, trying to triangulate between Judaism, Christianity, and Samaritanism. They adopted some traits of each and then dropped them and switched them around to come up with something that kind of fit in, but it wasn't a subset of those. And it looks like the original, there are like various comments on early Islam from Jewish and Christian sources from the time that are usually ignored. Well, in them, you get the impression that Muhammad was a kind of forerunner, a la John the Baptist, for Umar al-Faruq, who later is counted as one of the caliphs after Muhammad. But in this, he is the Messiah, because Faruq means the Redeemer. And he led, and the original Hijra wasn't the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina when things got hot there, but rather it was the pilgrimage, the wave of Jews and Arabs to recapture Palestine,
Right.
from the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
And so the Hijra was that crusade. And if that is a correct reading of it, and I found it pretty convincing, that would be yet another case where Jews, seeing somebody act in their interest, figured, what do you know? I guess this is God's Messiah.
Well, not only that, under the Ottomans, the Jews were living very nicely under their rule compared to the Holy Roman Empire, where they got treated like, second-class citizens, put in ghettos, and even killed often. So that kind of makes sense. And even if you go back far enough to the history, I'm sure, I don't know if you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Muhammad's family was from like Quraysh tribe, which was a Jewish tribe, like a half Christian, half Jewish tribe.
I've never heard that. Could be true.
Yeah. I don't know. I could be wrong, but I think maybe one of his sides of his family, it was like some sort of like hybrid Jewish Idumean or whatever. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'll put it on the top while I'm editing this.
Speaking of Herod the Great, who was half Idumean or
no, you know what? I shouldn't have said Idumean, because I might have thought of Herod the Great, but I am thinking of the Quraysh tribe, and I'm pretty sure there's some connection with Jews there.
I'll look that up. There's plenty I don't know about this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, me too. And so basically what I was getting at was what was I saying?
About the likelihood of Jews having a non-Jewish Messiah.
Oh, yeah. So then you got back to Vespasian again. Mm-hmm. If this would all be a fringe theory until you read, I think it's Tacitus, or maybe it's Suetonius, correct me, whichever one it is, but it says that he goes to Egypt and he's in the temple of Serapis, and a blind person comes to him and asks him to heal him, and then he spits on his hand and puts a spit in his eye, and he heals a blind person. And then a man comes in with a screwed up hand or something, and he heals his hand, and all of a sudden Vespasian's healing people. And this is right after that supposed meeting with high priest Johanan recorded.
Yeah, I think Josephus reports that.
Right. So it's like strange to me, or not, I shouldn't say it's not strange anymore to think that these ideas were floating around of Vespasian being the Jewish Messiah. And then there's also the Roman, the Roman way of doing things with where somebody conquers a land. For example, you got Britannicus, because he conquered the island of Britain, so he got the name Britannicus. Then there's Germanicus, and then you get all these. They like adopt these names of the places that they conquer, and I almost wonder if Vespasian conquering Judea sort of gave him the title of like he's like the Judicus, or like, and maybe that somehow plays along with him being a Jewish Messiah. You know what I'm saying? Like
well, yeah, because everybody gives a lot of demerits to Josephus, that he was a traitor and a turncoat. But that's what they were saying about Jeremiah when he says, look, you might as well forget it. The Babylonians are going to come here and destroy this place. Well, they threw him down a well for saying that. It may be Josephus said, we've sinned and we're about to get it. And that would mean that Vespasian was the agent of God.
The wrath, right.
Retribution.
And it's funny because even Nebuchadnezzar, who is like in the Old Testament, is the worst of all, slaughters the most Jews, he literally sacks the city. He is like the epitome of like the worst thing you could think of. But there's also parts of certain prophets call him a servant of the Lord, and acting as like an agent of the Lord's wrath, basically. Like the Lord sent Nebuchadnezzar because the Jews are so bad. And it wasn't, you know what I'm saying? So
the Assyrians, it says.
Yeah. So
he whistled up the Assyrians like a hunting dog to come get him.
Yeah. So you know, it almost makes you wonder if there's that same layer happening with Vespasian. And
I mean, it would be theodicy, right? It would be saying, like many ancient peoples said, oh boy, the foreigners kicked our butts. I guess we ought to switch over to worshiping their gods because ours didn't come through. For us, they must be mightier. Well, Jews on the whole didn't do that. And this may be the rationalization or the rationale, whatever, that they preferred to say, it's not so much that God wasn't on our side as that we weren't on his. And look at the covenant in Deuteronomy, we asked for it.
Right.
That's not a big leap if you're going in that. And people would prefer that rather than say, good God, there's no good God. There's no justice in the world. No. I don't want to believe that. I'd rather believe it's our fault than you blame the victim.
And then realistically, you got to think there had to be some Jews that had their faith shaken completely when they saw their tabernacle being carried off and when they saw their temple being desecrated. And you have to think that these people have probably lost their minds. They lost their faith. They probably moved away. And a lot of them probably were susceptible to Christianity later, a couple decades later, because it's like a replacement theology in a way.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, that's not too far.
That's ironic because Christians are always blamed, and I can see how, for saying, we're the chosen people of God. We're the new Israel, not you guys. You can see how there might be another motivation for that.
Especially when you look at the common themes of like the cursing of the fig tree, for example. And the reoccurring theme in the New Testament you see over and over and over again is that the Jews had it, but they fumbled it, and we recovered the ball. Now we have it. We're the new bride of God. Like we're the new Christians. The bride of Jesus Christ are the Gentiles now. And it's like you've seen like this new formation of like this new. They're taking the theology of the Old Testament and sort of sprinkling in like these Platonic stuff and pagan rites and all that, and then boom, you got Christianity. I mean, I'm sure it's not that simple, but progressively get to that point.
Well, especially since Christianity began in the atmosphere of Hellenistic cosmopolitanism, where, like, Plutarch was saying that Osiris has to be the same as Dionysus. They're just two different local names. And a lot of people did that. I mean, all the different gods, they said, this sounds an awful lot like so-and-so. Well, it must be so-and-so. And we know that, for instance, in the Epistle of Aristeas, this Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jewish writer says, well, basically, Jehovah, Zeus, what's the difference? Holy mackerel. We're told that many people identified Dionysus with Jehovah. Oh my God. But if that's possible, anything is possible.
But what you're saying is so true. If you, especially when you read Plutarch, Plutarch was obsessed with doing parallels. That was like his genre. He wrote all these parallels, and he did it with gods too. He did it with on Isis and Osiris, and he even mentions in the book, whatever you want to call it, manuscript, called Isis and Osiris. He mentions that Pythagoras traveled to Babylon and Egypt for 20 years and learned these Eleusinian rites and brought it back and started the school in Italy. So me reading this, I'm thinking he started a school in Italy about a dying and rising Persephone dying, or not dying, but going into hell and then coming back, and then saying, like, there, if you take part in the rites, you've somehow got eternal life because of Persephone and Demeter. And like that is like almost like a skeleton of like what became Catholic Church, I think. I mean, because then you got, I can't remember who, I think it was Justin that wrote, "This is not new nor strange."
That's right.
And it's like you put it all together, it's almost like there's a progression happening, you know.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite female names, Persephone. That's Demeter's nice too.
I said Persephone. I butchered that name. Persephone. Okay.
This is just what I've heard.
Right.
Oh boy. I mean, there's she's kind of like Ishtar, who went into hell to save Tammuz also.
But they said that that's where Pythagoras traveled, was Egypt and Babylon. He could have been here and that, and maybe he wrote his own version. Like, that seems plausible.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a great book to be talking about the origins of the fiery hell idea. And he says it seems to have come from Neo-Pythagoreans from Italy who spanned out across the Mediterranean, and they were from Sicily, where you could easily see volcanoes, fumaroles, geysers and stuff. And so they figure, well, there must be a fiery realm below. And they spread this idea along with their regular Pythagorean teaching all over the place. And that appears to be where it came from in Greek and Hebrew thought. The Jews already did have the idea of a subterranean kingdom of fire, but it wasn't a place of punishment. It was just the fiery kingdom of Molech, who received infant sacrifices. But it wasn't thought the little kids deserved what they got. It was just this horrible, of course, the Book of the Covenant and Exodus mandates infant sacrifice. So,
and then also Herodotus wrote about the Scythians, and in his books about the Scythians, he talks about a pit, an actual place called Tartarus, and it was a fiery pit. He says there was I don't know if he's describing a volcano hole, but he said that inside the pit is fiery lava, and I'm like, that sounds like it's the same exact name as the hell, the pit of hell that's mentioned in New Testament, Tartarus. That's the Greek word that's used for when Jesus is talking about don't end up in Tartarus. And then that brings me to a whole nother thing. I just thought of something too. Another thing about the New Testament is when you actually look at the Greek, not the English, when you look at the Greek, you can see how this is being told to a pagan audience. They're using terms like the kingdom of Uranus for the kingdom of heaven. And they're saying like Poseidon gives up its dead. that which is
Yep, yep.
gives up its dead. And the Hades,
Yep.
Hades can't hold me. Like if you're a Greek pagan hearing this for the first time, you wouldn't even know you're reading something Jewish. You would just think you're just reading another installment of Virgil and Homer. You know what I'm saying? That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, there's a really interesting book by Dennis R. MacDonald called Luke and Virgil, where he traces out a bunch of stuff I never noticed between the two. And he's done the same thing with Mark and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and with John and the Bacchae of Euripides. And of course, Acts is heavily dependent on that play.
Yeah.
It's just amazing that it's a lot more Hellenistic in the New Testament than anybody ever realized until recently.
Yeah. Yeah, we're getting close to that time, but I just want to before I let you go, I want to ask you about the Cthulhu mythos. I don't hear you. I mean, people get you on their shows. They always want to talk to you about the mythicism thing, but I want to hear, like, what is that about?
This is like a fictional, or should I say fictive pantheon that Lovecraft created for his bunch of his horror stories that appeared in the 20s and 30s in Weird Tales pulp magazine. And the idea is that there are that human beings are really totally insignificant. Of course, you get that idea from the book of Isaiah too, that one day will be gone, just like the pterodactyl and the trilobite. We think we're so great, and of course we are in terms of our artistic achievements and all that. But the religious understanding, the arrogance of anthropocentrism, we ought to get that out of ourselves. And to illustrate that, he has these beings that are from other dimensions or other parts of the galaxies that are utterly non-human. Like he describes Cthulhu as having a roughly humanoid body, but with rudimentary claws and membranous wings and the head of a huge octopus or squid, and that he was ages ago locked up in his city of Rillier, which then sank beneath the waves. And in the story The Call of Cthulhu, it rises out of the waves temporarily because of seismic activity, and you see it's built on a plan based on non-Euclidean geometry, and it is fascinating. Well, and
Really fascinating.
in another one, Yog-Sothoth is invoked by this semi-literate old farmer in the Massachusetts hills. He gets it to impregnate his idiot daughter, and this hybrid creature is the result, and it is fascinating. And he tells this all in a very staid, almost documentary style that makes you think, yeah, this is the real world that's intruded upon. And the old ones, or the great old ones, he calls them, are standing by to return and retake the earth, which is properly theirs, and that we might have a chance of staving it off. But few know about it. The few that find out about it are knocked off by these cultists. It's just so fascinating, a mix of mythology and science fiction, and with a genuine, I would say, religious tone, though Lovecraft was an atheist and a naturalist. But this idea I mentioned, Isaiah says we're nothing in the scheme of things. Yeah, Fritz Leiber pointed out this is just what Rudolf Otto was talking about in the idea of the holy, that we are undone contemplating this, which is the absolute reality, and that we know our nothingness before it, and we don't despair because it is just as fascinating in a Faustian way. Even if the knowledge will destroy us, we must know. And this is what happens to his protagonist. I've been devoted to Lovecraft ever since I read him when I was like 13 years old.
It sounds amazing.
Mm.
That sounds fair. So you wrote additions to this, like sort of
Yes.
like open universe.
A whole lot of people have, but I've written a whole bunch of them, most of which have been published, though, in small press magazines. I've edited a series of anthologies with taking one story of Lovecraft's and including stories that gave him ideas for it, and then stories based on it by other people, or about 20 or 25 of these published. And one new one just came out, 2 more in the works. And so I edit Crypt of Cthulhu. There's been like 110 issues of that ever since the early 80s. And I'm heavily into that just as much as I am into theology and the Bible.
Yeah.
And
almost like there's really no difference if you think about it, because if you think about like ancient paganism, like Homer and Hesiod are taking on each other's ideas and adding to them. And then Virgil takes that and adds to it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he just said the same thing with the Bible. He's like, you got these prophets coming around and, I'm going to take it from the Torah and I'm going to write, and here's my prophecy now. And it keeps, it's like there's a progression all the way from Genesis to Revelation of different people touching on it and adding more life to it. And it's like, there's really no difference between H.P. Lovecraft's universe and Homer and Hesiod's universe. It's just a different universe, but it's the same.
That's exactly
so mind-blowing. Right. And I love it because it almost makes it real. Like we're adding our logos to the mythos, the message that we're trying to get across, the law. The logos is like the law, the reason, the word, the truth. And the mythos is the story you're telling, and you put the two together, and you can actually shape the world. Like you're changing the world a little bit by giving all your art to the world. People interpret it, they take it on, and they do their own thing with it, and you actually have a play in how the world manifests and changes. Ever thought about that?
Well, Lovecraft has captured popular culture in the last 20 years or so, and it's far more popular. He would have been amazed if he could have lived to see this. The same thing is true with comic book mythology, especially with somebody like Jack Kirby, who consciously built in aspects of the Kabbalah and Marcionism and things into the Fantastic Four and Thor and all this stuff. And Superman, I mean, obviously he's a Christ figure from the escape from the planet to his death and resurrection. And the stuff is all written with a serious frame of mind, and it's just really spine tingling.
Even Star Wars has a sort of parallel to Nectanebo and Alexander. I'm your real father. And I'm thinking like, I read that, I'm thinking of Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. Like it's like these themes reoccur, and it just gets taught to a new audience with a new message, which is the new logos, basically. And that's just how we are. We're humans that love that stuff. We need that to survive.
And as Jung said, the archetypes that are communicated in these and loads of other ways are necessary for us to face them and encounter them. Like when Darth Vader says to Luke, if you only knew the power of the dark side. Yes, that is very important psychologically. These guys, Joseph Campbell and all that, they all knew Jung and so on. These things would never strike as deeply as they do and capture our attention if they didn't have this genuine power of myth.
Yeah, then that's a good thing to close on something positive and strong and powerful. And dude, I just want to tell you this. I really think that you're going to be someone that's going to be talked about centuries down the line. Like people are going to look at your work. I'm serious. You're doing good work, man, and you're I think you're a legendary thinker. I really do think that.
Oh, I appreciate it.
And thanks for coming on. And I'm sure you got stuff to do. Your family's probably waiting for you, so I won't let you go. And thanks for coming on, everybody. Like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, check out his Patreon. I'm actually one of your what do you call it? Patrons?
Patrons. Yeah.
I'm one of your patrons, and it's worth every penny. You write so much, you do so much work for your Patreon that it's literally like subscribing to something and getting a really good product out of it. So everybody check that out. And
thanks so much.
Hope I can see you later in the future.
Oh yeah.
All right.